Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you are all having a very good week. We are in this weird, almost summer, definitely not fully there kind of thing in the UK. So there we go. But anyway, let's get started talking about some of the books I've been reading this week. First up, I read Christ on a Bike by Orla Owen. Firstly, great title. And the title makes more sense as you read the book. It's not just the expression. But Christ on a Bike, I just want to say it again, it's a great title, is a book that focuses on a kind of an idea that I think I've seen like appear in a few films and sort of TV show kind of esque things before. But the core idea is that our main character inherits a large amount of money and property essentially in one fell swoop through quite odd means. So this isn't spoiling anything because this is literally the beginning of the book. But she essentially is traveling through a small Welsh town. She sees, she goes into a church. There is a funeral happening and there is a book sort of to leave thoughts and memories or prayers of the recently deceased man called Thomas Morgan. And she, just sort of on a bit of a whim, says, I'll leave a thought for him because nobody else has signed this book and I don't want him to go to the grave. I don't want him to sort of, his life to have kind of gone unnoticed. So she signs this book, and this sort of sets off this sort of chain of events where this essentially was a test, and she inherits a house in this Welsh village and a monthly stipend of about £5,000, which she has to spend, and there are very specific rules attached to it. So she can't give this money away. This money has to be used for herself, and she can't use bits of money in various other places. So she essentially feels oddly trapped eventually because she's got all of this luxury around her, but it's not really anything she can ever share. And it becomes this kind of tale of her trying to readjust to it, trying to find ways that she can push to the absolute limits of the rules. But one thing that kind of comes up in this book quite early on is this idea that the exact reason that she's given so much money and is not allowed to spend it on other people is because typically the kinds of people who would write down a prayer for somebody that they'd never met is going to be a good enough person who has been selfless for a lot of their life. And so this is almost their way of being selfish for a little bit and having some kind of luxury and being looked after. I thought this was a really fun and very interesting book. So much sort of heartfelt joy in it. And actually, it was one of those things where I was sort of looking as I was reading and realizing that they sort of published other books that I really enjoyed that have been very much this kind of big-hearted, loving kind of book. A book that sort of takes a core idea and plays with it, but the characters are very real, very human, very, very much full of love. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought this was a really great a really great, just beautiful story, and very interestingly told. And I don't want to spoil any bits about what comes later, but just a good yarn, essentially, and just a very lovely, heartfelt book. Next up, as part of my Booker project, I have been reading some of the books from the Quintet by Edwardson Aubyn. These are the Patrick Melrose novels, essentially. So he was shortlisted for the fourth book in this quintet, and this week I read the first three, which are, let me get this right, Nevermind, Bad News, and Some Hope. And I'll kind of take them all as one kind of collective, because in many ways I listened to an audiobook that was all three basically back to back, and so the blurred some of the lines between them are a little bit blurred for me, but essentially the core idea is we're following a character, Patrick Melrose, as he essentially floats through bits of his life. He lives a relatively privileged life, but so much of his life is dominated by essentially addiction and these sorts of very complicated webs of relationships with people, where there's also an element of that kind of class distinction and the kind of the politics of sort of upper class people. And it's a really interesting set of books for that, because they're written in this very, very sort of typically British, very funny style. It kind of almost feels a bit like sort of Evelyn Waugh or Forster, that kind of very specific point of view of, you know, middle upper class, often men, and kind of living this very sort of privileged life, but having these little sort of squabbles between themselves often. And they are very, very funny. There's lots of these sort of really silly side jokes. There are these sort of absurd situations that happen. They are slightly wild books at times in terms of what's going on. It felt very much like, yeah, that kind of strange, yeah, that very, very strange sort of upper middle class kind of humor and kind of things like that. It sort of just has this really, yeah, they're just enjoyable. They're very enjoyable. And as you know, I'm currently reading Mother's Milk, the fourth in the quintet, which is the Booker shortlisted one, and I'll talk about that next week. But a really really strange set of books, but really fun. I think there's so much kind of joy and silliness and humor in these very sort of slim novels, and they feel really like a throwback to a very specific type of writing, but with a slightly updated sensibility as well. Next up, I read Enter Ghost by Isabella Hammad, and this is a book that was shortlisted for the Women's Prize, very rightly so. I think it's fantastic, and it's a book that deals with some quite difficult and quite complicated issues, but I think in a really interesting way. I just did a solo review of this, so I won't go into too much detail about some of the other parts of it. But essentially, the core story is that there is a production of Hamlet being performed in the West Bank, and the book therefore sort of deals in quite a big way with Israeli and Palestinian politics, and it's, you know, this book doesn't really hold any punches. You know, the book pretty much starts with a border crossing, and, you know, sort of Israeli guards dealing with a Palestinian woman, and it's unflinching, it's unsparing as a book. It's really quite complicated at times in, well, not necessarily complicated, it's really quite intense at times. But I think is more powerful for it. I think it's a book that deals with this very interestingly. The core idea then is sort of as we move closer and closer to the performance of the play in the West Bank, we start to kind of see more about the kind of the relationships around the character, around our main character, and how Sonia, this character, deals with the kind of the sort of fairly unique pressures of staging something like this, of being part of it, and then sort of turns into a bit more of a meta commentary on the role of art in politics, and vice versa. So we get this idea that, you know, this play and the production of this play is going to be politically charged because of Israel and Palestine as a, you know, as a kind of continuing situation, and so we know that there's sort of danger, it's sort of laced with danger in some respects, but it also uses excerpts of Hamlet as a way of examining that. So actually, you know, characters in Hamlet speaking truth to power or speaking about their oppression are used as a way of sort of sharing about the Palestinian struggle. But equally, this is a play that is going to be performed in a place that, you know, it is very likely that there will be Israeli people watching this play. It's a play that then also is therefore sort of speaking to Israeli members of the audience, as well as the Palestinian ones. And so actually the ways that it will engage with both of those things, or both of those groups of people, is going to be complex, because at some parts of the play, certain people in the audience might identify more or less with certain characters. And so it kind of identifies that actually, you know, like a lot of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet has a sort of political relevance, that there's often these were characters of certain renown or certain power who would be spoken to or be engaged with as part of the politics of the book, of the play. So this book then sort of engages with that in a really interesting way, and looks at kind of the idea of art and politics, but also a play within a play, potentially within a play, within this book, and all of these other things. And I just think it's really quite complex and quite interesting. And I really enjoyed the sort of process of going through this book. I think it's a really exciting and interesting way of approaching this topic. And last but not least, Dara Horn with People Love Dead Jews. And it's, I realise, a very provocative title. Essentially, this book talks about anti-Semitism in a broad way, it's sort of through various essays. So Dara Horn shares about her own personal experiences of not only anti-Semitism, but also of kind of love for the Torah and love for kind of cultural practices and traditions within Judaism and within sort of Jewish communities across the world. But she also uses these essays to really explore a kind of more global picture of sort of the various ways that anti-Semitism shows up in things. And particularly core to the title of this book is this idea that often the main representations that appear of Jewish people in media, particularly books and film and TV, are often of Jewish people who have been victims of horrific acts. So she talks about how, for example, so often the Jewish story is told as basically beginning and ending with the Holocaust, right? That almost nothing else has ever existed within Jewish history. That's the one thing. And obviously it's a big event. It's a big horrific set of things that had happened, but she really sort of analyzes the ways that that is often seen as the beginning and end of all conversation. And so that has an implicit effect then on what happens next and how Jewish people are treated, because they are treated sort of in ways where, for example, the only time they might see themselves in museum exhibits is about the Holocaust or pogroms or various other things, rather than a kind of rich history of Jewish peoples across the world. So I think this book engages with that in a really interesting way. I mean, it also sort of focuses on some of the more micro and macro kind of elements of this. So she talks about how her son, at one point reading Shakespeare, again, coming up, sort of interacts with the character of Shylock, who is, and it's an interesting thing because there are obviously various different readings of how Shylock appears in Shakespeare, but is often seen as sort of falling under an umbrella of a kind of cliche of the sort of trickster Jew kind of character. And so she talks about how she's having these conversations with her son about sort of being like, oh, do you really want to read this play actually? Because I think it's I don't want you to kind of come away from this sort of seeing that the only representation of people like us in the play is people who are tricksters. But equally, it sort of engages with so many other things. So I think this is a really interesting selection of essays that were really thought-provoking, because she writes about where these things are more complicated. So she talks about the Holocaust Museum being a really great example of this, of telling history in a broad sense with lots of context, with lots of information, but not having it be sort of acknowledging various other parts around the Holocaust and other things that kind of make this a broader topic than just something where you go in, you feel a bit sad and then you leave. She sort of talks about actually wanting to really engage with the joys of Jewish culture, or the pride she feels at various things. And the book sort of ends with this essay talking about a group of people studying the Torah, and spending, I think, 7.5 years going through the Torah page by page, essentially as like a study group. And what that means is that they have this really rich sort of community of people who all have gone through this thing together for 7.5 years of studying, and come out the other end of it and often just start the whole process again. And she says that's really interesting in terms of what that brings up about this kind of idea of where religious texts often bring community. So I just thought it was a really interesting set of essays, that were really thought-provoking and very sort of really interestingly written. It's not a book that seeks to kind of hit you over the head with various things. It's a book that is very even-handed in terms of looking at issues from multiple perspectives, and I just thought it was a really well done book. Anyhow, those have been the books I've read this week. I hope you are keeping really well. I hope you're doing well, and yeah, have a fantastic week, and speak to you all very soon. Bye bye.